Sure, here's a hook that could set the tone. Asterisk, he was always just my dad's friend, until the day he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. And for a moment, I wasn't sure if it was admiration or something darker. Asterisk, does that vibe work for what you're going for? Absolutely. I'll expand on the first keynote to set up the tension, intrigue, and establish the characters involved. Here's a 500-word expansion. #####, keynote 1. The unsettling familiarity. I had always known him as my dad's friend. They were close, almost like brothers, though I never quite understood the depth of their bond. He was always around, at barbecues, birthday parties, and weekend get-togethers. Always just there, a constant fixture in the background. He had the kind of presence that filled up a room, but not in an aggressive way. It was more like the stillness of a storm brewing on the horizon, unnoticed by everyone except the ones who were paying attention. His name was Robert, but everyone called him Bob. He was the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. There was an unspoken respect that followed him wherever he went, like a shadow he couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried to blend in with the crowd. In a way, he was almost too calm, a little too controlled. Growing up, I never questioned my dad's friendship with him. Bob was always around, but he was never close to me. He was just another adult who had little to say to a teenager more interested in sports or music than the boring grown-up conversations that filled the air during family gatherings. He'd smile at me, ask how school was going, maybe tell me a story about my dad's reckless younger days, but that was it. We never really talked. I always saw him as part of the backdrop, like furniture or a lamp you never thought twice about. Always present, but never central to the story. It wasn't until one summer evening that everything changed. We were sitting outside, the night air warm and thick with the scent of grilled meat and freshly cut grass. My dad had stepped inside to grab another round of beers, leaving me and Bob alone on the back patio. I was on my phone, scrolling through messages when I felt his eyes on me. Too intense, too quiet. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the longer I sat there, the more it became impossible to dismiss. I looked up and there it was. Bob was staring at me, his gaze not just noticing me, but weighing me like he was seeing something hidden underneath the surface. I've never been good at hiding my discomfort, and I'm sure it showed. But Bob didn't look away. He just kept looking. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice cracked a little, betraying the unease crawling under my skin. He didn't answer right away. He just tilted his head slightly, almost like he was studying me, taking in the way the sunlight caught my hair or the way my fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of my phone case. "I was just thinking," he said after what felt like an eternity of silence. "You've grown up so fast, haven't you?" I didn't know what to say to that. It was a simple enough statement, yet the way he said it felt loaded, like it meant something more, something I wasn't ready to hear. I forced a smile, trying to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us in that moment. Something subtle, something dangerous that neither of us could name. He didn't say anything else after that, but the look he gave me, that was the last time I'd ever see him the way I used to. And from that moment on, I couldn't unsee the way he looked at me, like I was a puzzle he couldn't wait to solve. Or worse, a secret he was keeping just for himself. Absolutely. Here's keynote 2, 500 words, continuing the story's tone of quiet tension, emotional conflict, and psychological depth. It builds on the unease established in keynote 1, showing how the relationship begins to subtly shift. ####, keynote 2. The space between after that night, things were different. Not in a way anyone else would notice. My dad still laughed with him over old stories. My mom still greeted him warmly whenever he came by. But to me, everything had changed. There was a weight in the air now, an invisible thread between us that pulled tight whenever we were in the same room. I started to notice things I hadn't before. The way his gaze lingered a beat too long when I spoke. The way he always seemed to stand just a little closer than necessary. The subtle shifts in his tone, gentler, quieter, as though every word was meant for me alone. It wasn't overt, nothing I could point to and say, that's wrong. It was all in the in-betweens, the glances, the silences, the pauses that said too much. Part of me told myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was being dramatic, reading into things that weren't there. After all, Bob had known me since I was a child. He watched me grow up. I just stood there, pretending not to notice, pretending I was fine. When I climbed down, he smiled at me. That same calm, unreadable expression he always wore. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something possessive, something that made me want to run. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed it over and over in my mind, trying to convince myself it didn't mean anything. That was just an accident. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was intent there, quiet, calculated, and terrifying in its subtlety. He didn't touch me again after that. Not physically, anyway, but his presence lingered. He'd send me messages sometimes, innocent ones that could easily be explained away if anyone else saw them. How's college prep going? Or, your dad said you did great on your exams. Proud of you. The words were harmless, but the way they made me feel wasn't. Every message carried that same unspoken tension, that invisible something that tied us together in a way I couldn't escape. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to tell anyone. How do you explain a feeling? How do you prove the kind of wrong that hides in politeness and half smiles? My dad trusted him completely. To say anything felt like betraying that trust, like tearing apart something sacred. So I said nothing. But silence, I was starting to realize, has a way of growing teeth. Of course, here's Keynote 3, 500 words, continuing the story's tone of psychological tension and emotional complexity. This section deepens the narrator's internal conflict and sets the stage for the eventual reckoning between fear, silence, and truth. Hashtag, 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 Keynote 3. The quiet storm by the time autumn came. I had learned how to act normal again, at least on the surface. I smiled at family dinners, laughed at my dad's jokes, asked my mom about her day. I even learned how to look at Bob without flinching. Pretending became second nature, a survival skill, almost graceful in its performance. But underneath it all, something inside me was unraveling. He still came around. He always did. Some weekends, it was to help my dad with a project in the garage. Other times, just to catch a football game and share a few beers. He blended into our lives like he always had, his presence so familiar that no one questioned it. No one saw the tension that burned just beneath my skin whenever he entered the room. Sometimes I catch his eyes flick toward me, quick, subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it every time. And each glance felt like a reminder that he still held power over me, even when he said nothing at all. It's strange how silence can become its own kind of language. The way he spoke without words, the way I responded without meaning to. A turn of the head, a shallow breath, averted eyes, it all built into something that lived between us, heavy and unspoken. One Saturday, my dad asked me to drive over to Bob's place to drop off a toolbox he'd borrowed. I froze when he asked. My instinct screamed no, but my mouth said sure before I could stop it. Saying no would raise questions. Saying yes would keep the peace. So I went. His house was quiet when I arrived, too quiet. The air felt different there, stiller somehow, like time had paused just to watch what would happen. He opened the door with a smile. That same disarming warmth that everyone trusted. You didn't have to come all the way out here, he said, stepping aside to let me in. I told him I was just passing through, that it was no big deal. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. He offered me a drink, water, soda, whatever I wanted, but I shook my head. I just wanted to leave. The weight of the silence pressed down on me like a storm about to break. As I turned to go, he said my name. Quietly, almost gently. When I looked back, there was again that look. The one that started everything. The one that saw too much. But this time I didn't freeze. I met his gaze, steady and unflinching, even though my heart pounded in my chest. I wanted him to see it, the anger, the fear, the defiance all tangled together. For the first time, I wanted him to know that I knew. He opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't let him. Don't, I said. Just one word, sharp enough to cut through the air. And for the first time since that summer night, he looked away. That was when I realized power only works if you give it to someone. And I was done giving him mine. Absolutely. Here's Keynote 4, 500 words, building from the moment of reclaimed power and moving into emotional aftermath, truth, and quiet reckoning. This section centers on what happens when silence finally breaks, internally, if not yet aloud. Hashtag keynote 4. The weight of truth. For days after that encounter, I felt like I was floating outside of myself. Everything looked the same: the house, my family, even Bob's name on my dad's phone, but the air had changed. It was as if the world had finally tilted back into alignment, though not completely. I had spoken one word, don't asterisk, and somehow it had split something wide open inside me. It wasn't victory exactly. It didn't feel like strength or triumph. It felt more like exhaustion, like standing after being underwater too long. My lungs still burned, but at least I was breathing again. Bob didn't come around after that. My dad mentioned that he'd been busy with work, that he'd been meaning to call, that maybe they'd catch up soon. I nodded and said nothing. Each time his name came up, I felt my throat tighten, the words I wanted to say sitting there like stones. He's not who you think he is. You don't know what he's done. But then I'd look at my dad's face, open, trusting, and the words would die before they reached my mouth. How do you tell someone that their friend has crossed a line they'll never see? How do you explain something invisible, something that existed only in the quiet spaces between looks and gestures? I didn't know how to make it real without tearing something in my family apart. So I carried it. But carrying it started to change me. I stopped avoiding mirrors because I didn't want to see the fear in my eyes. I started going for walks at night, the kind that stretched into hours, just to clear my head. The world outside felt bigger than the one I'd been trapped in, and I needed that. I needed the reminder that life existed beyond one man's gaze. One night, while sitting on the back porch, my dad came out and sat beside me. He didn't say anything for a while. The air was cool, the sky washed in stars. "You seem different lately," he said finally. His tone was careful, gentle, the way you speak to someone standing on the edge of something fragile. "Is everything okay?" I wanted to lie. I almost did. But then I realized that staying silent would mean letting Bob keep something that didn't belong to him. My quiet, my peace. "I'm okay," I said softly. "I just don't like being around him anymore." My dad looked at me, really looked, and something in his eyes shifted. He didn't ask for details. He didn't press. He just nodded, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "Okay," he said. "He won't come around anymore." And that was it. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It felt like release. Like something that had been buried was finally beginning to breathe again. Maybe that was all the truth needed. Not a confession, not a confrontation, but the space to exist quietly and finally be free. Absolutely. Here's Keynote 5, 500 words, written as a quiet, emotional resolution that focuses on healing, reclaiming selfhood, and the lingering echoes of what happened. It closes the story with introspection and strength, while keeping its tone intimate and real. Hashtag Keynote 5. What Remains Time has a strange way of softening things. Not erasing them, but dulling their edges until they stop cutting quite as deep. Months have passed since I last saw Bob. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Other times like I can still feel the weight of his gaze in a crowded room. Healing isn't a straight line. It's more like the tide, rising, falling, retreating, returning. Some days I wake up light. Other days, I drown before I even get out of bed. But even on the hard days, I can feel the shift. I'm not afraid anymore. I started writing again. At first, it was just words scribbled in the margins of old notebooks, fragments of thoughts I couldn't say out loud. Then it became more deliberate. I wrote about silence, about being seen and unseen at the same time. I wrote about fear that hides behind smiles, and the kind of courage that comes quietly without witnesses. Putting it down on paper didn't fix everything, but it gave the pain shape. It made it something I could look at, instead of something that lived under my skin. My dad never asked me again about what happened. But he kept his word. Bob never came around. I could see in the small ways that he knew enough. The toolbox he'd borrowed never came back. The phone call stopped. When my dad mentioned him now, it was brief, almost detached, as if even he felt that something had shifted that couldn't be undone. I used to think closure meant confrontation, a moment of justice, of saying everything that had been swallowed. But now I think it's quieter than that. Sometimes closure is just the act of choosing yourself over your fear, of knowing that someone doesn't get to define the way you remember your own story. There are still traces of him, of course. Triggers that sneak up when I least expect them. The scent of aftershave that matches the shape of a man's silhouette in the wrong kind of light. But those moments pass. They don't hold me hostage anymore. I remind myself that I survived him, not just what he did, but the silence that came after. Sometimes late at night, I sit on the same back porch where all of it began. The air feels cleaner now, lighter somehow. I think about that version of me who froze under his gaze, who thought silence was the safest choice. I want to tell her she was brave even then, that surviving in stillness is still surviving. What happened will always be a part of me, but it's not the only part. I've learned that pain doesn't have to be wound forever. Sometimes it can become a kind of wisdom, a way of seeing the world more clearly. And when I look out into the darkness now, I don't see him anymore. I see myself. Of course, here's Keynote 6, 500 words, written as a contemplative coda. It closes the arc not with a dramatic event, but with quiet strength and reflection, showing how the narrator carries the past without letting it own them. Hashtag Keynote 6. After the quiet, it's strange how life continues, how the world doesn't pause to acknowledge the battles that happen quietly inside you. Seasons changed, birthdays came and went, laughter filled the house again. To everyone else, nothing had changed. But I had. There's a kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting for an apology you'll never get. For a long time, I thought I needed him to admit it, to say I'm sorry or I was wrong. But now, I understand that the truth doesn't need his validation to exist. It lived in me all along, waiting to be named, waiting to be believed. And believing myself turned out to be enough. Sometimes, when I think about him now, I don't feel anger. Not even fear. Just distance. Like looking at a photograph that no longer feels real. The edges blur, the colors fade, and what's left is just emptiness. He doesn't hold space in my mind the way he used to. He's become a shadow that no longer belongs to me. What I've come to realize is that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about reclaiming. Reclaiming the way you walk into a room, the way you trust your own instincts again, the way you let yourself be seen without shrinking. Every time I catch myself laughing freely or looking someone in the eye without hesitation, I think, this is what freedom feels like. There are still moments when the past tries to whisper back. A flicker of memory, a scent, a sound. But I meet those ghosts with calm now. They don't scare me. They remind me of who I was and how far I've come. A few weeks ago, I found an old photograph, one of those summer barbecues where everyone looked happy. My dad was laughing in the foreground, and there he was standing behind him, Bob. For a second, I almost tore the picture in half. But then I stopped. That image doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to me, to the girl who survived that summer, who learned what it meant to take back her voice. I slipped the photo into a box with the others, not to forget, but to file it away as part of the story I've already lived. I still visit the porch sometimes, especially at dusk. The air feels different now, lighter, cleaner. There's no trace of that heavy silence that once hung there. Instead, there's peace, a quiet that doesn't hide anything. If I've learned anything, it's that survival isn't loud. It doesn't always look like bravery. Sometimes it's as simple as waking up, breathing, choosing yourself again and again until it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like instinct. The past doesn't owe me anymore. I do. Of course, here's Keynote 7, 500 words, written as a reflective and empowering closing movement. It widens the lens of the story. The narrator begins to live again, reconnecting with the world and with others, transforming their pain into quiet wisdom and purpose. Hashtag Keynote 7. The shape of light, healing has a way of sneaking up on you, not as a grand moment of revelation, but in the smallest gestures that go unnoticed by everyone else. The first time I realized I was healing, it wasn't during therapy or in a tearful confession. It was while standing in line at a coffee shop. A stranger smiled at me, and I smiled back, without fear, without second-guessing what that smile meant. It was just kindness exchanged freely. I hadn't felt that in years. I've started letting people in again. It's not easy. Trust is something I rebuild brick by brick, slow and deliberate. I've learned to listen to my own boundaries, to honor them without apology. I no longer measure my safety by other people's comfort. There's power in that. My dad doesn't talk about Bob anymore. Sometimes, I catch him looking at me with that quiet guilt parents where when they realize they missed something they should have seen. But I don't blame him. Monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like friends, like family, like someone you'd never think twice about letting in. We've both learned to live with the silence that followed. It's softer now, no longer sharp or suffocating. It's a silence made of understanding, the kind that says, I see you, even if we never speak of it. I've started volunteering at a youth center in town. At first, I didn't know why I was drawn there, but I think I do now. I watch the kids, laughing, arguing, alive in ways they don't even realize yet. And I feel this fierce protectiveness rise up in me. They deserve to grow up unafraid. They deserve to be believed when they speak. Maybe that's why I'm there, to make sure at least one person will always listen. Every so often, when the sun sets just right, I think about that younger version of myself, the one who sat on the porch, afraid of her own voice. I imagine her standing beside me now, older, wiser, unbroken. I tell her she made it, that she doesn't need to carry the fear anymore. And I think about him too, Bob, not with hatred, but with distance. His name has lost its weight. He no longer takes up space in the corners of my thoughts. He is just a man who once existed and then ceased to matter. That, I think, is its own kind of justice. The truth is, I don't need to be untouched by what happened to be whole. Wholeness isn't about erasing the scars. It's about recognizing that you lived through something that tried to take your voice, and you kept it. Every morning, when sunlight spills across my floor, I let it fall on me without flinching. The light doesn't burn anymore. It feels like home. Would you like me to write a keynote 8 next? Perhaps an epilogue that shows the narrator years later, reflecting from a place of peace and purpose?